Hello everybody, and welcome to our first lecture on the theory of knowledge, also known as epistemology. Today we're going to be talking about the material you should have read about in KVSI chapters 1 and 2. That's Knowledge, a Very Short Introduction, chapters 1 and 2. If you haven't read those chapters yet, I suggest you go back and do so. There's a short pre-lecture video you can watch if you want to get some background, but it's actually very minimal because these chapters require very little background knowledge. Though they do give us a very useful background for moving forward from here. Since I'm going to assume that you've read this, I'm not going to spend as much time as I normally would discussing some sort of basic concepts that were covered in the material. Instead, I'm going to be expanding upon what we covered. Now, I am still going to do some review, but if you haven't already read this text, these two chapters, you might have a little bit of trouble following along. So, this section of the course is about the study of knowledge. This field of philosophy is called epistemology, from the Greek episteme, meaning knowledge, and ology, meaning study of, like biology is the study of life, right? Virology, the study of viruses. Epistemology is often considered the foundation of philosophy. It's tied with another field of philosophy called metaphysics for this honor. Depending on which era of philosophy you're working in, some people believe metaphysics is prior, others believe that epistemology is prior. And epistemology provides the basic tools we can use to understand the world, or more importantly, how we should understand understanding, what constitutes knowledge, which beliefs we ought to hold, that sort of thing. This makes epistemology a very important area of philosophy because it's all about these basic analytical tools that we apply to all these other questions we encounter. Epistemology is the origin, for instance, of scientific method. In fact, science is a particular epistemic system. It's a system for generating knowledge. And the trustworthiness of science is an epistemic question. There are some basic distinctions we should draw before we go any further. The first is between knowledge and beliefs. And the big difference here is that merely believing something does not mean you know it, right? I might believe that there is a gorilla behind me. That doesn't mean I know it. Now, this is partially because knowledge has a property called factivity, something we're going to talk about in a second. But that property generally means that for you to know something, that must be true. But you can believe falsehoods. You can't really know a falsehood. The other distinction is between knowledge and facts. Just like you can believe a falsehood, but you cannot know a falsehood, there are truths that you do not yet know, or you might never know. Just because something is a fact doesn't mean it is known to anyone. Right? One of the things that our author here, Nagel, emphasizes is that knowledge is a subject-object relation. That is, there is a knower for every known. Somebody knows everything that is known. That is not true of facts. That is, there may be infinitely many facts, and in fact there probably are, that nobody knows. Right? So there may be facts regarding which no entity has a belief, whereas all knowledge has to be related to some sort of believer or knower. So those are some of the basic principles before we move on. It is worth noting, as we begin reading this author's book, that they have made certain assumptions about the way that knowledge works. Now, this is probably for the sake of space. Right? If you were to try to analyze every single question about knowledge in a similar text, right, it would be enormous. In fact, I've got shelves full of books about those very questions. So there are some assumptions that the author makes, and she makes the assumptions that she believes are most representative of the field at large, and she's pretty much dead on with that regard. The key assumptions we need to talk about. First, knowledge is a substantial notion. This is pointed to in her rejection of the cynical theory. This means that there is something about knowledge. Knowledge is a thing that exists beyond belief, and it's not just an honorific, right? It's not just a word we throw around for important people's beliefs. Because we want to say things like, well, their beliefs can be wrong too. This is a rejection of what she calls the cynical theory, right? This idea that knowledge is just what we call those values and beliefs that the powerful believe are true. And there is some sociological evidence for things like that's how we use the word. But In epistemology, however, what we're looking for is less a linguistic account and more a substantive account of what it means to know. And we're assuming here that there's something more to that than just being the one who believes the most while holding the biggest stick. Another assumption here is that knowledge is factive, and this is a generally very well accepted principle. For something to be factive means that it can only be about a claim if the thing it is claiming is true. So you can only know that I am 5'11" if I am in fact 5'11", which is about right. So yeah, there you go. You can know that one. You know that one now. But you can't know that the moon is made of green cheese because it isn't. Right? Since it is not the fact that the moon is made of green cheese, that cannot be known. That proposition cannot be known. Other factive words are things like you see, remember, right? To see something or remember something means that it is there usually. There are times when this is less on the nose, but generally speaking, knowledge is a factive notion. More contentious points from the assumptions here. One is that knowledge is objective. That means what counts as knowing is a truth of the world, that there is an account of knowledge, there is a thing it is to know, and we don't say that, well, so if you use the example of Protagoras' relativism. So Protagoras believes in this historical account, which is a little bit stilted because it's carried forward by Plato, not Protagoras himself, that what happens is that everybody has their own truths, their own knowledges, even if they conflict. We are going to be starting out rejecting that view. While everyone has their own system of beliefs and they all think they know, since knowledge is factive, we're going to assume that knowledge is objective. Now, this is tied to an assumption that the world is objective. That is, the facts are objective. The world is one way for all persons, right? Not a multitude of ways for various people. We've talked about this distinction some, I think, but it's an important distinction here. So the idea being that there's a way the world is, there are a set of facts out there, it doesn't matter what you think about them, it doesn't matter how you react to them, it doesn't matter what you believe, the facts are the facts are the facts. This is a bit more contentious than her other assumptions so far. Another step up on our contentiousness ladder is that the assumption that truth is a matter of correspondence to the world. That is, for something to be true means that it just matches the way the world is. Now, this is a very intuitive notion of truth. The idea being that I sort of paint a picture with my words, and for my word picture to be true just means that it accurately represents the world. However, this is a really fuzzy concept, and what it means to correspond is a difficult notion. And there are alternative theories of truth that are out there. We won't be covering them because this book assumes correspondence and objective and factive knowledge. So we're going to leave some of those more complex issues aside. It is just worth noting here that this is a significant assumption of the method we're taking forward. Finally, this is less of an assumption and more of a willful regulation. Nagel points out briefly that there's a way in which we can say that the crew of a ship knows something that no individual member knows, right? No one on the ship knows how to sail the entire ship, but each crew member knows a task. Likewise, no one in an orchestra knows how to play the entire piece of music on all instruments. But together, the orchestra knows. This is a complex concept of knowledge and is related to some work in what's called group minds theory. This is not the typical base case of epistemology, however. So we're going to be leaving this aside as well. This is certainly something worth thinking about. And when we come to our political philosophy section, for instance, it's going to be something that might poke its head out again. But for now, we're going to be focusing on a simple single-agent knowledge. That is, a single person knows something. Right? We're also going to be focusing on what's called propositional knowledge. To know that, not know how. That is, you know a fact, not knowing how to do something. That's a very different kind of knowledge, and we're not going to be worrying about that here either. So that's enough of the basic terms here. let's turn now to talk about the substance of Chapter 2. Now, Chapter 2 introduces what is probably the most famous challenge in all of epistemology, and that is the challenge of skepticism. Skepticism emerges from a theory of knowledge proposed by the Stoics. Now, the way the Stoics thought that knowledge worked is that there were two things you have, right? You have impressions and judgments. An impression is the way the world appears to you. So, for instance, right now it appears to me that I'm looking at a camera, there's a microphone, computer screen, bookshelves, all of those are appearances. These are what we call impressions. A judgment is when you determine whether or not that impression is true. So, I am going to make the judgment that this camera is in fact here. So now I've made a judgment, right? Because I'm saying that my impression that there's a camera here is true, is factive, right? For the Stoics, we should only consider as knowledge wise judgment, which specifically means something to the effect of accepting only those judgments that are certain to be true. That is, only if you're absolutely certain that your impression is accurate, should you judge it to be so. And only do those judgments, those absolutely certain judgments, count as knowledge. Skeptics attacked this in a way that you might already be predicting, and if you've read the text, you can remember. They said, well, that's all well and good. We agree. We agreed that you only count as knowing if you're certain of truth. But here's the thing. You're never certain of truth. There are two schools that she talks about, academic and Pyrrhonian skepticism. Academic skeptics believing in the statement that you cannot know the truth of anything, essentially, that nothing is true, or you can never know anything. You can never know for sure. Now, one of the tricks there is that academic skeptics, in saying that, have asserted a statement as being true. And so you can say, well, how do you know you can never know? And that produces a problem. A problem that was resolved by the Pyrrhonian skeptics. And because of this, they're probably the school that's more important to understand. The way that Pyrrhonian skepticism works is that you just maintain doubt about everything. Everything could be true, sure. It could also be false. And you can't really tell for sure. The way you live your life, right, so you don't just, die because you're not sure if there's food or water in front of you. You live your life by habits and cultural norms. But you don't mistake that as being knowledge. Interestingly, Pyrrho and Sextus Empiricus, who recorded Pyrrho's writings, believed that this was a gateway to enlightenment. And there are some similarities here between, say, Pyrrhonian skepticism and Buddhist skepticism, or Buddhist epistemology, and it's unsurprising because Pyrrho traveled to India during this time, that releasing your feeling that you know the world or that you can control the world in a way that you can't is a way to eliminate certain stresses, right? If you just acknowledge that you can never be certain, then the drive for certainty is no longer going to be something that you're obsessed with. So skepticism, right, is the challenge effectively that there is no knowledge, or we can never know that there's knowledge at the very least, attacking the Stoic theory of knowledge. Skepticism has become, from its inception and until today, right, until right now, is one of the biggest issues in epistemology, one of the largest challenges that epistemologists have to resolve. But not all skepticism is created equal. We should distinguish between kinds of skepticism. Now, this is something that Nagel doesn't talk about, so pay close attention. This is something we're going to be talking about that's sort of adding on to the book materials. The first distinction we need to make is between universal and domain or domain-restricted skepticism. A universal skepticism comes when we are skeptic about every possible belief. That is, every realm of knowledge, we're going to say there just isn't knowledge, right? Math, skeptic. Ethics, skeptical. Physics, skeptical. Math, I almost said math twice. History, skeptical. Music, skeptical. Right? There is no such thing as knowledge across all domains. This is a relatively rare view in everyday life, though it does have a long philosophical tradition. More common is what's called domain skepticism or domain-restricted skepticism. That means skepticism that is restricted to a particular field of knowledge, or purported knowledge, saying that you can't have any knowledge about this topic. Probably the best known domain skepticism in the world today is agnosticism, which is skepticism or domain skepticism about theological facts or the existence and nature of God. Agnostics are people who believe that you just can't know either way whether or not God exists or what properties God has. This is a very restricted skepticism, right? They're skeptic specifically about theological facts. But these same people presumably believe that, yes, 2 + 2 = 4, I know that, right? I might know physical facts. That is, they're not universal skeptics. This is one important distinction to make, then, between universal skepticism, which is mostly only seen inside of epistemology, and domain skepticism, which is much more widely spread. And all it takes to justify a domain skepticism is to justify doubt about whether or not there is knowledge regarding some specific set of facts. And usually what you'll do to motivate a domain skepticism is to point to something special about the purported set of facts that prevents you from knowing about them. In the case of the agnostic, it has to do with the transcendence of God, right? Theology and the entity that we are discussing, right? The concept of God itself is supposed to be beyond human grasp. Because of that, we just can't have anything that we claim is knowledge about it. Another division in skepticism that is maybe a little bit less important, but still important to talk about, is knowledge skepticism versus justification skepticism. The base case of skepticism is knowledge skepticism. That is, we don't believe that there's any such thing as knowledge. Justification skepticism goes a step further and says there's not even such thing as a justified belief. Now, the distinction between knowledge and justified belief is probably pretty clear, right? On the one hand, knowledge is supposed to be factive, but justified beliefs are not. You can have a justified false belief, right? You can be totally reasonable in assuming that there isn't a monkey hiding in your closet right now, but if you open the door and there's a monkey, well, it was false. But it was a justified belief because that would be a strange thing to happen to you on a given day, right? This is not, at least in my world, in my everyday life, something that happens to me very often. I don't open my closet to monkeys. So, the distinction here between knowledge and justification skepticism is, on the one hand, saying that we can't be sure, or we can't ever really claim that we have knowledge, versus saying, on the other hand, that we can't ever claim to be justified, which is a much stronger claim. Because you could still get around just being justified and acknowledging that you don't have any knowledge. Justification skepticism is most common as a domain skepticism. So something like the agnostic, again, might say, not only can we not know about the existence or non-existence of God, but because it's so beyond us, because it's so much beyond human comprehension to understand an infinite, eternal being, right? We can't even have a justified belief about it. The only justifiable response is to go, I don't know, maybe, I guess, it could happen. I'm not even sure I understand what you're describing to me, because you're necessarily involving concepts that are beyond my comprehension. A justification skepticism, a universal justification skepticism would be very strange and very thoroughgoing. It would just say that all beliefs are arbitrary, there is no such thing as justification, there is no such thing as rationality. That is incredibly rare, and I honestly can't think of anyone who would support that right now. But some people would support a justification skepticism over a specific domain based on the principle that if you don't have relevant facts available to you, you shouldn't decide between alternatives. That is, you should just say, it's undecided, I can't distinguish between the possible choices here, so I have to remain out of it, right? I have to say nothing. Whether or not you find that plausible depends probably on the case, depends probably on the domain being discussed. So those are some kinds of skepticism, and adding a little bit more depth to the skeptical case beyond what Nagel says. And these are important distinctions to remember as we move forward. So skepticism is motivated by two separate challenges. The first is the argument from error. The way this goes is something like, if we might be wrong, we're not justified in believing that we know. All right, so I'm in a context where I feel like I know. I know that there's a camera here. So if I'm in a context where I might be wrong about that camera, which means if there's any other context where my impressions would be the same, like the Stoics would say, right? These things that I perceive in the world would be the same, but the judgment would be false, then I can't say I know that there's a camera there. And there are ways the world could be where my impressions would be the same. I would still have the impression of the camera right in front of me. And that judgment that the camera is right in front of me would be false. For instance, I could be dreaming. This could be the Matrix. Or, as Descartes would say, there could be an evil demon controlling my mind. Right? These are far out there possibilities, but they are possible. Therefore, because there's a potential for error, I'm not certain. And as the Stoic theory of knowledge goes, I don't count as knowing unless I'm certain. So there's no knowledge, or I can't know in this context. The second challenge is the problem of criterion, where the argument from error essentially is a negative argument, denying, well, this, right? Is this sort of each case going, well, this could be, you could be wrong, you could be wrong, you could be wrong, right? Shrug, shrug, shrug. The problem of criterion is a much more, I think, focused challenge. The problem of criterion goes as such. Well, you say you know. Well, what does it mean to know? Give me your way of distinguishing knowledge from mere belief. Let's say you're a Stoic and you say, well, it's wise judgment. That's knowledge. Okay, how do you know that wise judgment is knowledge? Right, and you can see already there's going to be a regress, right? How do you know what knowing is? How do you know what knowing is? How do you know that no, right? And you get that infinite regress building up, and eventually you're just running your hands through your hair, and usually you probably leave at some point in time. Historically, that's been what people do. All right, I'm done. That's cute and all, but I'm done. But there is a substantive challenge here, which is you need to provide, if you're going to provide a theory of knowledge, you need to provide a non-arbitrary criterion of knowledge. That is a non-arbitrary way to distinguish knowledge from true belief. And that is really challenging, because it seems like you need to know how you know. And once that's the case, you run into that infinite chain. So as people try to respond to the skeptic, they're going to be trying to respond to both of these challenges. They're going to be trying to respond to the argument from error, that is providing a reason that we should believe that error is not a serious risk under at least the idealized circumstances. And they're going to be trying to provide a criterion for knowledge as a non-arbitrary method for distinguishing knowing from believing. So let's take a look at a couple of the solutions that people have proposed throughout time. A common theme of all of these solutions is going to be that we're going to be using skepticism as an epistemic starting point. That is, one of the first things we have to do, trying to propose a theory of knowledge, is to resolve the challenges of the skeptic. We need to answer them, and then we can move on. The goal is to provide a criterion that can survive skeptic challenges, right? That can survive the argument from error and not be an arbitrary criterion. There are two general approaches to this. The first is particularism, which is you start with a single known and then abstract to a method. This means you start with a single known proposition or known thought, something you know, and then you abstract to a general account of what it means to know based upon whatever it is that made that single proposition special. The other is Methodism. Note to distinguish this from the religious belief system of the same name. We're not talking about Methodism as the branch of Christianity. We're talking about Methodism in epistemology, which starts with a method, hence the name, and then determines its knowns. That is, the Methodist starts with a criterion and then tells us what things we know, whereas the particularist starts with the things we know and then tells us what the criterion is that helps us distinguish these, that tells these apart. René Descartes, provides an excellent example of how we might respond to skepticism. And if you did read those passages, you're going to be seeing a lot of information here that will help you contextualize that. So René Descartes, from 1596 to 1650, he was a French Catholic philosopher. He provides one of the most famous responses to skepticism in the history of the world. So in his Meditations on First Philosophy, which is inarguably, at least I would say inarguably, his most important text, René Descartes is trying to provide an epistemic system that can support the modern scientific worldview that was emerging around him, the Galilean view of the universe that was math-laden, and for reasons we don't need to get into here, inconsistent with the dominant Aristotelian epistemology of the time. To do this, he begins this project of tearing down his belief systems and leaving only those things that survive radical doubt. This is essentially evoking skepticism. What he does is provide a list of many skeptical arguments that would have been familiar to readers of the day, and culminates in what's called the evil demon hypothesis, or demon doubt. The evil demon hypothesis is as follows. Imagine there were a being as powerful as God, that is, all powers that one could imagine, and many that you couldn't, that had as its sole purpose, its sole interest, deceiving you about everything you believed. Well, sure, a dream might make me doubt the physical world around me, right? If this were a dream, then this wouldn't be here, this wouldn't be here. Okay, that's fine. I'll give you that. But the evil demon pushes it way further. Because if the evil demon wanted to, they could make it so that 2 + 2 = 5, while all of us believe 2 + 2 = 4, because they can do anything. So what we need, Descartes believes, to build epistemology on, if we are to survive the skeptic, is something that can resist even the evil demon, even that most powerful possibility of error. The first Meditations, then, is really just a bulked up version of the argument from error. It is a several-page long argument from error, aiming to just rip apart every single kind of belief we might think we have that counts as knowledge. After he's ripped it down, it's time to build it back up. And in the second Meditations, Descartes points to a single proposition, a single fact that you can never doubt. This is the fact often enshrined in the common phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Now, it's important to note that that phrase, as written, did not actually occur in the Meditations, but we still call it the cogito because it's the passage from which that idea is defended and in which that idea is promoted. The idea being that no matter how deceived you are, no matter how powerful the demon is, it cannot be deceiving you into thinking you exist when you don't. There's a lot of question about why that is. It's not clear why Descartes believed that. One argument, which is almost certainly wrong, but still useful to think about, is the idea that, well, if the demon tries to make me believe I don't exist, something has to be doing the believing, that must be me. Ta-da, I exist. More probably, he just thought it was a brute psychological fact that you simply could not doubt your own existence. Not really. You could theoretically doubt it, right? You can go, oh, what if I didn't exist? Yeah. But you cannot, deep down, in the same way you can doubt the existence of angels, doubt your own existence, right? Or doubt the existence of a certain book on my shelf, right? You can doubt that much more easily than you can doubt your own. You can doubt your perception of colors. You could even doubt your own physical body. But to doubt that you have a mind, essentially, because Descartes believed that the most important part of you was your mind, right? To doubt that you have this center of thinking is fundamentally incoherent. This is a particularist method, right? So he pointed to a particular thing we know, a particular known. We know that we exist. That cannot be doubted. And then he abstracted a method from it. The method he pulled from it is, well, what is special about this idea? And he believed it was two properties called clarity and distinctness. Ironically, it is not very clear or distinct what he meant by those terms, but it seems to be something like a psychological assurance. That is, when you consider your own existence, it's solidly clear that you exist. It's absolutely clear to you. No hesitation, no doubt. Using this, he then produced an entire epistemic system based upon these clear and distinct ideas. So you can see here how a particularism works, right? He took a particular idea, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, and abstracted a method from it. Look for beliefs that are clear and distinct, and you find your true knowledge, your doubtless knowledge. So that is, in theory, both how one would respond to the skeptic, and importantly, how one would respond to the skeptic to a particularist view. Let's look at some more recent solutions. These relate to semantic externalism. Now, this is covered in Chapter 2 of the text, so if you start getting lost, definitely reread those passages. But you should probably be able to follow along as well here. This is based off a theory called semantic externalism. Semantic externalism is the theory that the meaning of words, that is their semantic properties, semantics means meaning, is at least partially derived from causal histories in the external world. So that's the externalism part. That is, what words mean is determined by the world just as much as it is what's in our head. There are two approaches to this, or two ways of using semantic externalism to kind of defend against the skeptic. The first is Hilary Putnam's attempt. Hilary Putnam takes the brain in the vat hypothesis, which is essentially the evil demon but made modern-y. Think the Matrix. The idea here is that, well, maybe my brain is floating in a vat somewhere hooked up to a computer that's just pumping me full of computer hallucinations. And I'm not actually living this life that I think I am. Well, funny thing, if words get their meanings from their interaction with the external world, then we could never actually mean that in the proper language, right? Because then we'd only have encountered computer vats. And it's not that our brain is in a computer vat. Our brain is in a physical world vat. So we'd have the wrong causal history to even express the skeptic idea. This is a kind of strange approach, though it was promising for a little bit. But there's some serious challenges that arose rather quickly. The first is that this seems to extend skepticism even to semantic contents. That is, even most skeptics would agree that we knew what words meant. Even if those things didn't exist in the world, even if we didn't know that statements are true, we'd at least say things like, I know what the word hand means, even if I can't tell you if I have one. Putnam is challenging that. Putnam is now saying that actually you could essentially be wrong about what hand means. Even the basic meaning of your terms could be wrong. Another problem here is it doesn't work with what we call new transfers. That is, someone who was captured in the real world and had their brain pulled out of their head and plugged into the vat. Then it wouldn't work for them because now they still have the proper causal history to refer to vats appropriately. So they would be able to formulate the skeptic challenge. A more sophisticated approach here is brought forward by David Chalmers, who's a philosopher at NYU right now. So the brain and vat beliefs for him are going to be true, actually. Because when we talk about the external world, we mean the world that we are experienced in. To say that semantic externalism requires a particular physical world is actually a mistake. All that semantic externalism says is that the meaning of the words that we use is partially determined by their causal histories in the world around us. If the world around us happens to be made out of bits and bytes rather than atoms and molecules, well, that's fine. That doesn't change anything. So, according to Chalmers, those same everyday beliefs that we would say were true for us, most likely, just in a physical world, are going to be true in the brain and vat world because we have the proper causal histories. Now, one challenge here, though, and this is one that extends from Putnam to Chalmers, is it still doesn't work for brand new transfers, right? Because in that case, again, my causal history is wrong, right? I came from a physical external world, and then my brain was pulled out, and now it's all bits and bytes. And so now I need to be skeptical again, because I can't be sure that I wasn't put into a brand new vat world 5 seconds ago. This leaves space for the skeptic to return. Now, if you're anything like me, you've probably just, yeah, we get it. Oh, what if you don't know? And there's a tendency, and I feel torn, because some days I really like the skeptic. I'm like, yeah, that's a clever point. And then there's like, all right, we get it. Skepticism is boring. It's dull, and it's not useful. And there are philosophers that have tried to push skepticism aside. Two of the most historically important are G.E. Moore and Bertrand Russell. So G.E. Moore was famously asked, well, how do you prove the existence of external objects? Now, this is also in your book. And he says, well, here is one hand and here is another. That was it. That's all he said. Right, here is one hand and here is another. Therefore, external objects exist. The reasoning being that hands are external objects. Now, this was kind of a snarky comment, wasn't really an actual response, but Moore eventually developed it into one. And the response is something to this effect. I've got a choice when you present me with a skeptical argument. I can either believe in the basic beliefs that my hand, these common sense everyday beliefs, my hand is real, yeah, that's real, or I can take into account the possibility that there could be a demon controlling the world, messing with my head just for fun. One of these two is much more common sense. And he suggests that when you are confronted with complex philosophical ideas that aim to overthrow common sense, you might want to trust those common sense reasoning more. Now, by common sense, he means very basic common sense, right? That you have a hand, not things like, oh, well, this is a physical object, there's no space in it. Because you might acknowledge things like, well, physics tells us that most of physical objects are empty space. That's fine. So it has to be very basic. Now, this idea of basicness is a bit fuzzy, and really what we need is what's called a properly basic belief. Now, this is something a little bit extra from beyond the text. A properly basic belief is a belief that is properly basic. That is a belief it is proper to believe in without any justification. it is not clear what qualifies as a properly basic belief, and there is debate amongst various philosophers about whether X or Y is a properly basic belief. For instance, Plantinga believes that belief in God is properly basic. Most philosophers disagree. Whether or not belief in the reality of your hand is properly basic depends, and I can't tell you on what. And in fact, Moore is going to tell you kind of the same thing. You can't actually provide total proof of the truth of something, especially not against all possible doubts. But you can provide conclusive reasons. And this is a really clever distinction. Right? The skeptic seems to be demanding that you give us absolute proof of the certainty of the truth of the thing you are saying to count it as knowledge. Moore's saying, actually, we don't need proof. We just need conclusive reasons, which are reasons that are powerful enough to conclude the argument. That is, we don't need to be certain about our certainty. We just need to have a conclusive reason to be certain. For instance, here is a hand. Conclusive reason by Moore's standards. Likewise, while we can't defend from all possible doubts at once, we can defend from individual doubts. So you might say, well, how do you know it's not a cybernetic hand? And I'll go, all right, hold on, and slice open the hand and take a look at what's inside and say, well, there you go, clearly not cybernetic. Right? And then you go, well, there we go, we know it's not a robot hand. Great to know. But then you might go, well, how do I know you're not an alien? Okay, well, let's sequence my DNA. And go through that process, right? So I can answer one question at a time, but if you just go, how do you know? That provides an unanswerable sort of context, an unanswerable sort of question, and is ultimately not valuable for philosophy. So Moore would suggest that we just not take the skeptic all that seriously. This is a view shared by Bertrand Russell. And Russell uses his principle of inference to the best explanation. That is, the way we go about thinking in the world is not about certainty. It's about the best way to understand things. So you tell to me that there's an evil demon. Well, Descartes tells me, right, there's this evil demon messing with my head. And Putnam talks about this brain in a vat guy. And then there's someone saying, well, actually, no, the world is just pretty much how you perceive it to be. There's cameras and apples, and all these things are really there. They're not demon touch. They're not brains and vats, right? It's just real. Russell's going to say that one's probably the best explanation. Importantly, just because something is logically possible, that is, it is logically possible that there is the evil demon, or that we are brains and vats, doesn't mean that it is reasonable to believe it to be true, or reasonable to give it any credence whatsoever. Everything, almost everything, is logically possible. Right? It is logically possible that I'm 95 feet tall with 6 sets of wings and, a bright red jumpsuit. It's logically possible. But it's not a really reasonable thing to go about basing your life on. Likewise, it is logically possible we're in one of these radical skeptical contexts, the evil demon or the brain in the vat. But let's be serious now. Come on. This is not a useful way to live. Now, Russell runs into a challenge, and Moore as well, which is to say, well, how do we know that your explanation is the best explanation on Russell's part? And Moore's is, well, how do we know that your beliefs are properly basic beliefs? And this seems to be a revenge of the skeptic. They'll push back as they do, but it's worth noting. So the questions to think about moving forward. Right? So we've talked about skepticism, we've talked about the basic terms of epistemology. The question now is, well, what do you do with this information? So there's 2 things to think about as we move forward in our counting for a theory of knowledge. The first is to ask yourself, well, am I with Descartes? Am I with Putnam and Chalmers? Am I with most, probably, epistemologists throughout history who believe that we need to answer the skeptic? Or am I with Moore and Russell, who believes that answering the skeptic is really just sort of a waste of time, and may even misdirect us, right? Might turn our epistemology to these weird hypotheticals, as opposed to practical questions of what we should believe. The second question is, does the threat of skepticism force us to reconsider the Stoic theory of knowledge and other related theories of knowledge? That is, maybe should we get rid of this concept of certainty? Or is the impression judgment system a little bit ill-defined? Is there something wrong with it? Right? Because the Stoic challenge does seem to be a direct result of the Stoic theory of knowledge. So maybe it just indicates that we're defining knowledge wrong. So these are 2 questions to think about as you move forward. 2 questions that will give you a better appreciation for how epistemology will develop and what we're going to learn in the coming weeks. So I hope that this lecture was clear. I know we've gone through a lot of material today, but if you've read the 2 chapters in the book, you should probably feel like you were able to follow along reasonably well. If not, let me know. That's what one of the questions in the letter this week is going to be, is, hey, do you feel like you were able to follow along? So definitely keep that in mind.